All right. All right, we are being recorded. Good stuff. All right. Welcome, everyone. We're just allowing people into our webinar space. So we'll take another another minute perhaps while people are joining before we get started. Good to have you all here. It's a good size group. And I guess, are we leaving this up while people enter the screen? I guess so. I'm talking to Leah, not there.
Sorry.
We'll just leave this up for the beginning. Okay.
Yeah, let's get started. We can.
Okay. All right. Are we good to go?
Yep, good to
go.
Okay.
All right, we're good to go. Thanks. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar, our joint ecological ministry webinar called Addressing the Ecological Crisis, an Integral Perspective. It's so great to have you with us. I'm Darlene O'Leary. I'm the coordinator of Martha Justice Ministry with the Sisters of St. Martha of Antigonish in Nova Scotia, Mi'kma'ki, and I am part of the joint ecological ministry team. Wonderful to have you here. So this webinar is one of two events that we're going to hold to bring faith communities together to explore possibilities in action to address the ecological crisis in an integral way using the Laudato Si Action Platform. So if you've been with us before, you're familiar with some of the topics we've discussed, and this will be along the same lines. And I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the Laudato Si Action Platform, but we'll talk a little bit more about those things as we proceed through the webinar. I'm going to just welcome you all, and then I'll give a land acknowledgement, and we'll have a prayer, and then I'll do a brief overview of the agenda. All right, so starting off, I'll just begin with our land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that we live and work on Indigenous territory. For me, I'm in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This land is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq nations first signed with the British Crown in 1725. We know that generations of settlers have not honored these treaties. So we commit to building a new relationship of trust and friendship with all Indigenous peoples as we walk the path of reconciliation and right relations. We are all treaty people. So I welcome you all to write in the chat the Indigenous territory where you are located. So we're going to move on now, I believe, to an opening prayer, and Sabrina is going to lead us in that prayer.
Thank you, Darlene. This is a prayer that comes to us from Pax Christi, England and Wales, and Catholic Nonviolence Initiative that I found through the Laudato Si prayer book, for those of you that may not know about that resource. So if we can take a moment for what I have enjoyed being called this collective deep breath, to be appreciative of our time together during this afternoon's webinar in this gathering for joint ecological ministry. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. God of mercy and compassion, open our hearts to your grace. Give us the courage, we pray, to radically transform our own lives and appreciate more deeply the covenant you made with all creatures on earth. Help us to respond to the cry of the earth and of the poor as peacemakers who challenge the violence that threatens us all. Guide us along the path of nonviolence to reconnect with nature, to value all peoples of the earth, to consume less and waste nothing. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with your peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
What I meant to add was that this was a prayer for peace from that same guidebook I mentioned, given that today is the International Day of Peace. As we gather with all these different points, I think I'll stop talking about that part later. Darlene, if you wanted to go ahead and take it from there.
Sure. Thank you, Sabrina. And just before we get started, I'll do the usual reminder about Zoom. I think everyone is so very familiar with Zoom at this point that we know most of how it works, but we'll especially just request that you stay muted while the presentation is taking place, just so there's no background noise or interference. But otherwise, we'll have an opportunity to have some discussions later on in the webinar. So I'll just quickly overview our agenda for today's discussion. We're going to start off with prayer, and we just did that. So presentation will be next, and our presentation will take about 40 minutes or so. And I'll do a little intro of Mark Hathaway, who's our main presenter. Then we'll have an opportunity to do some reflection together. So some time with small group discussion, and then we'll bring it back to a larger group. So in total will be about an hour and a half. All right, so that's a very general overview of the agenda. So I think we'll just get started, and I'm going to introduce our main speaker today, who I think most of you will know already, Mark Hathaway. So Mark is the Executive Director of the Jesuit Forum for Social Faith and Justice, and has worked in the past for both Scarborough Missions and the United Church of Canada. Together with Leonardo Boff, he wrote The Tao of Liberation, Exploring the Ecology of Transformation. Mark's doctoral research investigated the nature and experience of ecological wisdom. And Mark currently teaches courses on sustainability, ecological worldviews, and transformative learning at the University of Toronto and with the Earth Charter Initiative. So we have quite a knowledgeable expert with us today who's going to lead us in this conversation. All right, so Mark, you want to go ahead?
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Darlene. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, I think it's actually up, isn't it? Okay, great. Let's see, just make sure. Yep, that's working. Okay, so today it's a delight to be here to see many familiar faces, and just want us to take some time today to reflect on the ecological crisis from an integral perspective. In particular, we often talk about an environmental crisis or sometimes a climate crisis. I think the way we frame the crisis is important when we try to think about how to address it as well. So just a quick overview of what I'm planning to do is looking at this crisis, particularly using kind of a biodiversity lens. There's many lenses you could use to look at it, but that's the one I'm going to focus on mainly today, and look at some of the spiritual and ethical dimensions of the crisis and how everything is interconnected. This idea of wicked problems, which maybe people haven't heard of, but they're basically problems which are difficult to define, and they require a kind of integral, complex approach. And then from there, move on to just looking a bit, moving toward the Laudato Si action platform and plans. So when we think about this thing that often gets called the environmental crisis, I think it's important to recall there's some really great quotes here from Laudato Si. And one is this idea that to seek only a technical remedy to each environmental problem which comes up is to separate what is reality interconnected and to mask the true and deepest problems of the global system. And, you know, we see that there's often a very technocratic approach to things. Okay, we have climate change, so we need solar panels. Now, it's not to say solar panels are bad. They're good in many ways, but we need to look at things at a more holistic level, I think. And this idea, of course, that we're not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. And I like to use the word ecological because ecological has to do with relationships. It's really a crisis of relationships. And once again, the idea that a truly ecological approach is always a social approach. It integrates questions of justice, and this idea of hearing the cry of the earth and cry of the poor, that phrase that Leonardo Boff first coined many years ago. But really hearing the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, in some ways, it's one and the same cry. So when we think about the ecological crisis from the more scientific point of view, one framework that I found really useful is this one. It's this idea of planetary boundaries. And it's kind of like that middle circle, the safe operating space for humanity is in the middle there. And you can see where the boundaries have been already exceeded. Novel entities is really talking about things like pesticide use, chemicals, radioactive waste, etc. That one's just being quantified actually way over that one. Biosphere integrity, a lot of that is biodiversity loss, another one that's greatly exceeded. The nitrogen and phosphorus has a lot to do with the use of artificial fertilizers and manure management and how that's getting into our waterways. We see climate change. I think we know about that one pretty well, but land change, cutting down forest, putting in soybean plantations, etc. And then there's some things like ocean acidification, etc. There's a lot of these, but the important thing to get is that all of these are actually interconnected. I mean, it's good to be able to see this kind of diagram, but really all of these affect each other. So we can't reduce the ecological crisis to just a climate crisis. That's obviously a huge concern, but it's part of a greater whole. And we know also what that diagram doesn't show is also the crisis around inequality and injustice. And I think this image is really powerful. I mean, I've actually seen something like this in Brazil, and I think that's where this image is from, with the apartment building with the swimming pool on each balcony overlooking a favela. I mean, I saw something like this in Salvador de Bahia many years ago. But it's really a metaphor for our world, isn't it? I mean, we have, the wealthiest 20% or so consuming most of what the earth gives. And in fact, we have 8 billionaires now who hold more wealth than the poorest half of humanity. Right now, the ecological footprint globally of humanity is about 40 or 50% larger than what the earth can sustain. But 86% of that consumption is done by 20% of humans. So, the other 80% are consuming very little in comparison. And we also know that it's this 100 corporations responsible for 71% of greenhouse gas emissions in the last few decades. So, often when we talk about the ecological crisis, there's a sense that humanity is at fault. Well, we know it's not all humans. There are systems in place here, and particularly those at the top, and the closer to the top, the greater the responsibility. And that's just showing how, 50% of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of what consumers emit, that doesn't always include all the big fossil fuel companies, but 50% comes from the richest 10%. So certainly is not equal. Another interesting thing is to meet the Paris climate targets, it's estimated it would cost about $500 billion per year over 30 years. Sounds like a lot of money, but that's just 1/3 of global military spending. It would cost 15 trillion total, but would result in $30 trillion in savings. It's a great investment. Don't think military spending is such a great investment, right? And 5.6 trillion was spent on the war on terror, which really didn't seem to result in much of any good. But also, when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, certainly if we took about half or 2/3 of all military spending, we could meet the Paris climate goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. and still not use all that money spent in military spending. So once again, it's not that these problems, that there isn't enough money to solve the problems. It's a question of political will and priorities. Why use a biodiversity lens? Why is biodiversity in particular important? Well, all these things are important, but I think biodiversity has some particularities we might want to think about. First off, there's a certain concreteness about the loss of living creatures, living ecosystems, and climate change even is a bit abstract, I think, for many people, but biodiversity, I think, touches us all in different ways in a very concrete way. There's strong spiritual and ethical connections. What does it mean if each creature is an expression of the creator? Each, as we'll see, as Meister Eckhart says, every creature is a book about God. What does it mean to be losing these creatures? That's also connected to climate change, land issues, indigenous rights, food production, zoonotic diseases. It connects to all kinds of things, all kinds of crises. And it's arguably, along with that, novel entities, the planetary boundary that's already been most transgressed. I mean, we're in the midst of, the sixth great mass extinction. And another thing is that there's an upcoming biodiversity conference in Montreal. It's not the COP27 that we're hearing about climate change. There's another conference of the parties, 15, is taking place in Montreal this December. These meetings don't take place as often as the others on climate change, so there's an important opportunity here as well. But in order to kind of deal with it, to think about this in another way, I would like to take a moment to just do this forest meditation. Sometimes when we think about these things, it's statistics, and we don't feel what it really means. Now, this particular meditation is kind of a rainforest meditation, but obviously, the loss of temperate rainforest or boreal forest is very similar. So I'm just going to play this as a video and do a bit of voiceovers with it at the same time. Everyone hear that okay, the birds?
Can hear it, but it's a bit soft.
Okay. Just going to, I'm going to see if I can share my sound. Okay. Is that better?
Much better.
Okay. Imagine that you're in the midst of a dense, humid forest full of life. You might want to close your eyes if you want to look at the images, that's fine as well. Hear the sounds of the birds. Perhaps you hear the sounds of water, the insects. A place teeming with life. You can smell the humid earth and plants. Fill your senses. Sunlight filters through thick green foliage above, and you can feel the warmth of the sun on your face. What is your perception of life as you stand in such a place? What are you feeling? Now imagine that it's simply gone. And all goes to the ground. Since this meditation began, an area of forest equal to about 50 city blocks, it's about the size of the UT campus downtown, has been destroyed. Of course, in reality, those forests are spread out across the earth. They might be lost in small pockets here and there. So it's often hard to perceive the scale of what's happening. But nonetheless, it happens, continues to happen day and night. By tomorrow this time, we will have lost another 500 square kilometers of forest. That's about the size of Montreal and Vancouver combined. Some of that land will be further devastated by mining, perhaps oil sands development, new highways, cities, and similar activities. We believe that over that same period, about 175 species will be lost forever. So in reflecting on that, I don't mean to shock, but I think it's hard for us to perceive things sometimes, what violence is being done to the earth and to all its creatures. And if it's painful to feel that, I guess one thing that we could be tempted to do is to shut down, to ignore, not want to hear, not want to know. But ultimately, the fact that we feel pain for this is a sign of our connection, of our compassion. We care about what's happening. It's painful because we are connected to the earth. We're connected to all of life. And we know that, the Creator is revealed in all things. But to think about, 500 square kilometers, each unique communities of life, we're losing communities really. And 175 unique species, that's a hard number to know for sure. We don't even know how many species there are on Earth. But each of those species took millions of years to evolve, maybe hundreds of millions. Each has something unique, a unique wisdom, a unique contribution to the community of life. So the sixth great mass extinction, the greatest mass extinction since the time the dinosaurs disappeared. But on a more practical level, I guess, too, is the loss of resilience and the possibility of ecosystem collapse. So I think there's also a spiritual dimension to this, a loss of meaning. Thomas Berry said that humans came into being at the most advanced stage of the Cenozoic era because we couldn't exist in a less beautiful world. The beauty of the earth feeds our souls. The beauty of the earth nurtures our spirits. And I know for myself that being out by a lake or in a forest refreshes me. It gives me life. It's often where I have a very strong sense of God, the Creator. And he says, to bear the burden of intelligence and responsibility that we have, we need the solace of the natural world. And I very much believe that, and probably one of the reasons why so many young people are experiencing eco-anxiety is also the lack of connection with the more than human world. Meister Eckhart, as I mentioned earlier, said, every creature is full of God and is a book about God. If I spent enough time with the tiniest creature, even a caterpillar, I would never have to prepare a sermon. So full of God is every creature. One of my favorite quotes from Eckhart. But Laudato Si also says quite a few similar things. Beautiful quotes. Every creature has its own purpose. None is superfluous. The entire material universe speaks of God's love, God's boundless affection for us. Soil, we often forget about soil, but soil is the most biodiverse place on the planet. Water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. God has written a precious book whose letters are the multitude of created things present in the universe. There is a divine manifestation in the blaze of the sun and the fall of night. And paying attention to this manifestation, we learn to see ourselves in relation to all other creatures. We are part, instead of an environment, we are part of an earth community. And that community is a big part of what gives us meaning. Obviously, we have community with other people as well, but we're also in community with all life. Thinking about connections between biodiversity and other dimensions of the ecological crisis, we know that with respect to climate change, that droughts, global heating, desertification, wildfires, and floods all threaten biodiversity. I mean, many species aren't able to move to a cooler climate fast enough, or massive forest fires, droughts, all these things are affecting biodiversity. But also when we lose a biodiverse place, particularly a forest, forests act as giant air conditioners. The Amazon basin being probably the most important one on Earth, but all forests have that ability. They also hold soil, all these things that they contribute, help dampen, they sequester carbon, both in the trees and in the soil. And that soil, as I mentioned, is actually the most important carbon sink there is. So when we destroy a forest or plow up the land or destroy the land, we're also emitting greenhouse gases. Connections to social justice. We know that indigenous peoples hold about 20% of the Earth's land that they actually administer. I mean, it may all be indigenous land, but the parts that they still actually manage. But those territories contain 80% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity. So working for things like land back and indigenous control is also a great way of working for biodiversity. Mining, deforestation, and similar development projects threaten both biodiversity and the livelihoods of the poor, often indigenous people, but certainly peasant farmers, many others. And the destruction of forests can lead to diseases passing to humans. I mean, Ebola is one of the best known, but it's also thought COVID in part could have passed into humans this way. But certainly as people move into, especially in dense population cities encroaching on forests, this becomes more common. And of course, those most affected by the pandemics, as we've seen, are the poor. There's connection to water as well. I mean, think about plastic pollution and these things. Both plastic pollution and ocean acidification, which is caused by more CO2 being in the atmosphere, turning the oceans acidic, lead to biodiversity loss. Manure and fertilizer contamination cause algae blooms, like sometimes we've seen in Lake Erie, but certainly at the mouth of rivers like the Mississippi, that lead to dead zones. And it's thought that by the year 2050, we might actually have, by weight, more plastic in the oceans than fish. So all of these things interconnect. And those are just a few examples. So when we speak of, instead of speaking of an environmental crisis, I think we need to speak of an ecological crisis. Windleberry says, the world that environs us, that is around us, is also within us. We are made of it. We eat, drink, and breathe it. It is bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh. There's no environment separate from me. I mean, the water, someone asked, in my case in Toronto, how close am I to Lake Ontario? It's right here in this room. I'm, 70% Lake Ontario water. The lake is in me. The air I'm breathing has been breathed by every living creature that's ever lived for more than 3 months past, that's ever, we're interconnected with all of life. And really, so when we talk about an ecological crisis, we're talking about an interconnected crisis. Even climate crisis, I think we do need to talk about climate crisis, but let's not reduce it to just the climate crisis. This is a wider crisis. It's an ecological crisis because it is literally a crisis of the oikos, which is our home, the earth, our common home, as Laudato Si says. I also think more figuratively, we know that logos isn't exactly logic, but if we can be a little bit playful here, ecology, the logic, or even the wisdom of our home. Can we learn the wisdom of our home? And biodiversity is that store of wisdom. Each creature has something unique. Perhaps an important solution. I can't create fertile soil, for instance. I don't know how to do that. But there's all kinds of microbes that are experts at that. So this is also, I think, a spiritual and ethical crisis. And there's an interesting quote in Laudato Si that gets a phrase that in English gets in my mind very badly translated. And I discovered this because I was reading Laudato Si in Spanish and found this great quote. And I thought, that's such a great quote. And I went to use it in English. And I said, that's not what I read in Spanish. And it's this word eclosion, which is also in the Italian. So the actual, what it says in English is that the present ecological crisis is one small sign. Eclosion is not one small sign. It's a concrete manifestation of the ethical, cultural, and spiritual crisis of modernity. I think it's a much stronger quote. I don't know how that got past the translator or what translator did that, but this is a concrete manifestation of an ethical, cultural, and spiritual crisis of modernity. The other one critique I would make of Laudato Si, which I think is generally a fantastic document, is that whenever it speaks of anthropocentrism, it always has to talk about exaggerated, or I don't know, it always puts a qualified adjective to it. I think part of that is a misunderstanding of what anthropocentrism means. Anthropocentrism means treating the more than human world as a resource, as lacking an intrinsic value, as only having value insofar as it's useful to humans. So we really can't have exaggerated anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism is an egotistical, self-centered way of thinking. And it ultimately leads against humans. It's an anti-human ideology, anthropocentrism, because to the extent that we are anthropocentric, we ignore the value of the whole living community that we're absolutely dependent upon for survival. So let's just really work to move beyond anthropocentrism. The philosopher Neil Vernon many years ago said, that we have to think of the ecological crisis as the visible portion of a much larger entity that largely lies beneath the surface beyond our daily inspection. And that, I think, is exactly what Laudato Si is referring to when it talks about this concrete manifestation of a deeper ethical, spiritual crisis. Indigenous author Winona LeDuc, Anishinaabe, writes, the difference between worldviews, one that views the land as a rich ore body or a playground, another that views it as a source of great spiritual and cultural wealth. So once again, is the forest a storehouse of raw materials? Is it, something for us to use as instrumental value, we call that, or is it a community of life that has value in and of itself, that also enriches us spiritually? Raimon Panikkar has a beautiful quote, kind of an obscure publication. He said this about ecological wisdom. He says, he affirms that ecological wisdom is not simply wisdom about Earth. Rather, it denotes, and this is his language, a subjective genitive, i.e. the wisdom of Earth herself, which discloses unto us once we are open to understand it and stand under the spell of what she is revealing to us. For me, from a human perspective, this implies learning to be guided by Earth's wisdom. Can we open ourselves to the wisdom of other creatures? And I think that also is a big sign of hope. What you're looking right now in this picture is an area of China called the Loess Plateau. The picture on the left was that plateau before a large-scale ecological restoration project. The one on the right is the after, it's the same place. Amazingly, that change took place in 10 years, even though the damage had been done over 2 millennia. I think this is the hope that the Earth has a huge regenerative capacity if humans are willing to work with the Earth. But we cannot save the Earth alone. We need to work with other creatures. It's the trees, the soil microbes. As humans, we have a gift sometimes for bringing those elements together, helping to orchestrate things, maybe facilitate it along. We can be good facilitators if we learn to listen. But ultimately, well, we, and I say particularly some of us, the more wealthy we are, the more so, have created the crisis. We can't solve this problem. We need this diverse wisdom of all Earth's creatures and all religions, all spiritual traditions to solve this. We need to open ourselves to the wisdom of the Creator manifest in creation. Another kind of idea of Panikkar is science as an empathic apprehension and identification, liberating communion with the thing or the being that we're trying to know. Can we practice science in that way? I think there are scientists who do that. Some of the best scientists do that. But I think all of us are called to that kind of loving apprehension. And once again, this is why biodiversity is so important. As I said, the ecological crisis is a multidimensional complex crisis. I won't go too much into this concept, but one way of understanding this is that we're dealing with what are called wicked problems. Now, wicked problems are not about the devil, even though, as someone says, they're almost diabolically complex. But the thing about these problems is that every problem, they connect to a whole bunch of other problems. And there's not a simple yes, no solution, good, bad solution. There can be a better, worse solution. But you have to look at them in an integral perspective. They can take a long time to evaluate. You might never solve them totally, but you have to keep working at it. But the good thing about this, there's a good side to this. It doesn't seem like it, right? I mean, I think this scares my students when I talk about it. But the good side is that sometimes one solution or one initiative addresses multiple problems. It's having a way of thinking that we don't try to split things up into little pieces. Okay, we're going to work on climate change here. We're going to work on food over here. We're going to work on social justice over here. No, it's all connected, right? And often the solutions are connected. So a few quick examples, a community garden might help restore biodiversity. We do organic agriculture, you restore soil, you create a carbon sink. You also maybe build community, right? I'm sure many of you have been involved with these types of initiatives. So you bring a community, maybe you're addressing a food problem, maybe you're addressing poverty, maybe you're helping a community organize. So you're doing all kinds, maybe you're attracting pollinators and restoring bees here. You can be doing all kinds of things at the same time in one initiative. I'm thinking of Guelph's Old Growth Forest project. There's one group of local indigenous people who are using this as a ceremonial space. There's recreation trails now. The trout, the fish are back in the creek. And it's a beautiful place if you're on a retreat to walk and connect. So you're addressing multiple things. Land back, there are initiatives of indigenous people who want to do medicine gardening or food gardening or do things which also might restore biodiversity. Once again, indigenous peoples globally have been the best protectors of biodiversity, while also addressing justice things. So just to say, these are a few quick examples, but I think in many cases, one initiative addresses multiple things. So when we think about the Laudato Si action plans, we have these 7 beautiful goals: response to the cry of the earth, response to the cry of the poor, ecological economics, sustainable lifestyles, education, spirituality, community resilience, and empowerment. One thing you do might address several of these, because ultimately they're all connected. And so it's useful to have the goals in mind, but it's also useful sometimes to step back and say, these kind of merge together. This kind of covers multiple things. And that's great. That's the beauty of it, because it is an ecological crisis. It's a crisis of relationship. Whatever we're doing that's building relationships between people and with the land and helping to restore life is addressing the ecological crisis. And so there could also be many areas of action: land, soil, food. I think some of these are lovely because they help people really to connect in a very, visceral way with land and with other creatures, right? But also great for building community. Transportation, bicycling, public transportation, maybe switching to electric vehicles. That's probably lower on the scale than the public transportation and cycling and walking, but certainly that comes in. Buildings, retrofits, how we try to reduce the footprint of our buildings. Spirituality, ethics, education, conserving and regenerating water, capturing water. And once again, doing something with the land might also help restore the waters, reducing or eliminating waste, writing relationships, social justice. All of these things, once again, one thing might cover more than one of these, but they're good things to keep in mind when you're thinking about trying to do a Laudato Si action plan. Another thought, I'm just kind of sowing the seeds here. I'll let you kind of harvest them afterwards. But Joanna Macy she actually talks about 3 kinds of action. I subdivide one of them. So this is my take on Joanna Macy. Also thinking about kinds of actions. One is what she calls holding actions. So slowing down the damage. David Suzuki has a great clip in an interview with Bill Moyer, I think it is, about how a lot of environmentalists have concentrated on this. So stop the clear cut, stop the dam, stop the pipeline. Now, the thing is, these things are really, really important. We obviously want to slow down the damage. Absolutely important. But they can't be the only way we're acting. The second that Joanna talks about is getting to the roots, seeking out the roots of the pathology. So the importance of analysis, changing feedback loops. So changing feedback loops might be something like what putting a price on carbon begins to do. Changing the way we tax things. So maybe we're going to put a plastic tax on or something like that. So you try to, create new kind of feedback loops that encourage good behavior, discourage things that are damaging. But then there's also what I like to call prefigurative or visionary action. I think religious communities sometimes are really good at this one. So the idea of creating alternatives, something like a seed sanctuary or, doing something interesting with your land, maybe with a retreat center, maybe something that really helps bring community together. I think these are important because people need to experience hope and engagement at probably that kind of community level. If we reduce all the action either to individual action, which is important, and then the kind of big advocacy action without anything in the middle, I think we get a bit disconnected. I think these kind of intermediate actions are important and where you can kind of try out something new and experiment with it. And then there's also things around shifting worldviews and values, transformative learning, spirituality, ethics. Once again, to say one action might actually fall into multiple categories here. It's not to say that one thing, it could include analysis, visionary action. It might also shift worldviews, but at least to have that in mind. Finally, I'm just going to finish off going back to biodiversity for a second. There's the big biodiversity conference, I think, of the decade is coming up in December. Some of you might have heard about this. It was supposed to take place in China, and because of the pandemic and different things, it's happening in Montreal instead. So we've all heard of COP27. That's the climate change conference that I think is in Egypt this year. But there's also COP15 on biodiversity. They're both conference of the parties, but they're different. There are two things that started out at the Rio summit long ago. So that COP15 is in Montreal, nice and nearby, from December 7th to the 19th, most important one of the decade. And they have these aims of conserving 30% of land and sea globally, hopefully in partnership with Indigenous peoples. I think that's a question of debate there. Restoring 20% of degraded freshwater, marine, terrestrial, reducing invasive species, reduce nutrients loss, nature-based contributions, etc. These are a few of the demands. But just to say that this might be an interesting opportunity since it's taking place so close by in Montreal. I think we have till the end of the month or so to people want to do presentations or workshops or attend the conference, but maybe this is an opportunity. So I'll just lead with a few questions that we'll be looking at. What new thoughts or ideas do you have? I think we're going to be looking at these later, so maybe I'll just turn this over to, I think Leah's going to talk about this more, so maybe I should just, leave that slide behind and turn it over to Leah's, capable hands at this point.
Thanks, Mark. It's Leah.
Leah, okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. And you did it in the 40 minutes. Well done. It's always a challenge when doing these types of presentations. So thank you so much for all that really interesting information. We are going to shift gears in a minute, and we are going to move into some discussion pieces. Before we do, I just wanted to give an opportunity for folks, if you have any clarifying questions for Mark about anything that he shared in his presentation, you can raise your hand in real life, or you can raise your hand virtually, or put it in the chat. I'll just give a minute for that if people have questions. I'm not seeing any hands yet. It's possible someone is typing something. So I'll just give it another 10 or 20 seconds for folks to finish typing and hit enter if that is the case. And I would encourage those of you who don't have questions to just take a minute, do a little stretch. I confess, one of the things I really like about Zoom is I can turn my camera off and I can do like lunges and stretches in my office just to keep my body moving, because I'm one of those people who focuses better when my ears can function better if my body is moving. And so feel free to do whatever you need to do to get your body moving and feel good. So I'm still not seeing any questions. So at this point, I'm going to assume that we are ready to move ahead with our next portion, our more interactive and discussion portion. So I have 4 discussion questions in a Google document. So I'm putting that document in the chat for you right now so that everyone has that, because we're going to have one question as a big group and then we're going to break up into smaller groups. So I want to make sure that you have these questions with you and that they are handy when you go into your small groups. But the first question we are going to do as a group, and that question is, what is at the front of your mind after this presentation? Are there any words, images, facts, or other examples that stand out to you? And thank you, Sabrina's dropped this specific question in the chat as well. So I'm just opening this up to the whole floor. There was a lot of really great information that Mark shared. And of that, what is still kind of replaying in your head? What words are still replaying, or images or quotes? You can just unmute yourself if you feel so moved, or if you want to drop something in the chat, you can do it that way too, as you wish.
If I can just jump in, I mean, the forest meditation was quite devastating, and you know, it kind of brought me to the point where I usually go, which is, you know, how do you maintain your motivation, your hopefulness, you know, being aware of the scale of things. You know, making a very active hope, as you mentioned, Joanna Macy, and a lot of her work is around active hope. So that's kind of where I was landing with it, but it was so very helpful, and yeah, sitting with that reality is tough, but also hopefully motivating.
Yeah, thank you, Darlene. Anyone else want to share? Sister Pat Boucher?
Yes. In contrast to that, I just found that image from China of how they had renewed that in 10 years. Just gives you such hope that this is doable. We can do something.
Yeah.
And if I can just add to that, you know, there's all kinds of examples of this from around the world. There's places where rainforest has been restored in Brazil, like from places like 20 years, going from what looked like almost a desert to a rainforest. So there are incredible possibilities actually in all of this.
Yeah. Our planet is incredibly resilient when under the right conditions, when we give it what it needs to regenerate and recover. It's incredible. I've got a comment here in the chat box from Agnes. I'm thinking of supporting Indigenous protected and conserved areas, a great program here in Canada, and their invitation to participate in their knowledge blanket. And then there's a link if someone wants to check that out. Is there anything else that anyone wants to share? Reactions to the presentation. I love that quote about every creature is a book that tells us about God. That one's sticking with me. I'm gonna put that one up on my office, I think, somewhere as a little reminder. Okay, my co-hosts can jump in if I've missed something, but I'm not seeing anybody else at the moment jumping in to talk. So at this point, we will be shifting into small group discussion. So again, here are the questions. So if there's anything else that people want to share in a smaller group setting about what is front of your mind after this presentation, and then what new thoughts or ideas do you have as a result of this talk? What kinds of speakers or examples would be useful to help you further those ideas? And what ideas would you like to share with the larger group today for further discussion or consideration? So as you may, or as you hopefully know, this is part one of a sort of a two-part webinar series. So we will be coming back on October 20th to have a follow-up discussion. And what we as a coordinating committee, as GEM, are looking for from you are what's percolating in your brain? What do you want to learn more about? What's exciting you? So what we're looking for when we come back to the larger group is those points of interest and inspiration. And then at our second webinar, we will be bringing to you some speakers, some examples that hopefully match with the interest that is expressed today, so that we can continue this conversation and further our work on Laudato Si action planning. So Sabrina is going to put you into groups of about 4 or 5 each. If you haven't clicked on the link yet, please do so for those discussion questions, because once you go into the small group, you won't be able to see our slides or screen sharing anymore. So you'll have about 20 minutes for your small group discussion. If you finish before then, you can always come back to the large group. So a little pop-up will come up saying you have been invited to join breakout room X, and you click OK on that. Sabrina?
Leah, you're much nicer than me, because if I assign the breakout groups, nobody leaves before you're supposed to. You're stuck there. So I will be creating a number of groups. As Leah said, you're going to get the pop out. Some co-hosts might be assigned into the breakout groups. If we leave, it's not because we don't like the company that we're in. We just need to come back to the main group so that we can manage the Zoom meeting accordingly. So thanks everyone, and just give us a second to transition into smaller breakout groups.
I'm looking at room 3, Sabrina. It looks like 2 people haven't accepted the invitation there. So it's just 2 of them who are in that room. And there's also only 2 in room 5. Do we want to maybe merge them?
Yep, give me a second and I'll work on some options.
For sure, thanks.
Rejoin us from the breakout rooms. So just some friendly reminders that we are recording this portion. The breakout room sessions, of course, are not recorded unless Zoom has a new feature that they've neglected to let us know about. So we do have a couple of notes before we close out the session. But was there anything that from the breakout room sessions that anyone would like to share with the wider group, with the main session? If you would like to do so, please feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, and feel welcome to share any of those insights or ideas or inspirations that perhaps have come up. I see movement, but no monkey hands, no, oh, Darlene, go ahead.
I'll just add a few brief notes from our group. Someone mentioned that they're reading Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass as a really inspiring, there it is, Sabrina's got it. An inspiring example of Indigenous wisdom. Robin Wall Kimmerer is an Indigenous American woman, and also scientific knowledge. So bringing those two pieces together is very helpful. We also talked about the importance around some of Mark's talk, the example of plastic and the plastic pollution that is impacting us all, and especially the oceans, and how that it's important not just to kind of get recycle or anything like that, but to actually stop the production of plastic, and ideas like taxing or banning plastics. We discussed, we threw around some ideas about having, for a speaker, an Indigenous person with a scientific background to help us with our conversation. And we talked a little bit about some examples from religious communities and what they're doing that can act as kind of an inspiration, an example for growing some of the networks in the larger community. So one of the examples was the Heirloom Seed Project that I think it was the Sisters of Providence were involved in, and then a number of different initiatives grew out of that. So those were a few of the things that we discussed.
Thank you, Darlene, for that. Sister Sue, you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So in our group, one of the key messages was around any initiatives we take. It's great when they can foster signs of hope and life, and talk about some examples of that around the Toronto area. In terms of policy that might flow from this meeting, because we often do have policy flowing from our GEM meetings. I was reading an article from the World Wildlife Fund Canada that talked about Canada's pledge to protect 30% of land and water, in connection with COP15 coming up. But they talked about how it's not just about the amount of land, but how those protected lands connect to each other. And it's also about how the land is being managed. So how important it is to have that Indigenous management of a good part of that land. So that might be a policy piece that we would want to pick up out of this meeting.
Thank you, Sister Sue. I know that there was a webinar yesterday I haven't had a chance to watch from Operation Noah, looking at the Anglican Church's use of land. And I've forgotten the rest of the title of that, but I'm sure it's findable. So all that is to say, this is such a broad ranging conversation, and certainly a pointed one. Anyone else with any thoughts or sharings, ideas or inspirations that came out of the group meetings? I don't see anyone's rapid movements in their Zoom window or hand up. I will move to our next place.
Yeah, so again, what we're kind of trying to get from these answers in this discussion is, what do you want to hear more about? What do you want to learn more about? So Heirloom Seed Project, we could potentially see if someone associated with that could come and speak at our Part 2 event. The question of Indigenous management of land, we could look into maybe bringing someone in who can speak to that. So what other areas are you interested in hearing about?
I'll share a bit about what our group talked about, we thought it would be helpful to focus on water specifically, because how important water is. Sorry, just like, you have to, can you mute yourself? We have more than one person in the room. The focus on water, the ways that water connects also to biodiversity. As you would look at COP15 coming up in Montreal, the way the issues around plastics is connected to water, the importance in Indigenous cultures or Anishinaabe culture of the role of women to bless and care and pray for the water. The idea of really, when we talk about the need to end fossil fuels, it's also about how the production of fossil fuels really wastes water. So when you look at fracking, which they're talking about again in New Brunswick, how incredibly wasteful that is for water. So the idea of connects also with Indigenous folks and many poor communities who don't have access to clean water. So the idea was, how could perhaps religious communities focus on water as a policy issue going towards the COP15 event?
Thank you, Genevieve. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for those pieces. I know that we wanted to pass on a few different reminders. So first off, just a friendly reminder, or if anyone has any questions about the Laudato Si Action Plan Toolkit that was circulated earlier this year, the assessment tool rather, to help folks get the ball rolling for their own action plans. The English version, I've just put in the link there. In fact, I'm going to do that again just to clarify that it's the English link. And then for anyone looking for the French link, it's just here as well. Give me a moment to flip through different screens. And then of course we do have, as Leah had mentioned, the second part scheduled of this series. I will put the link in the chat box, but Leah, was there more that you wanted to add towards how we're going to collect ideas for the next one and any other information?
Yes, I think you're all on our email list. So I would encourage you to send us an email if you have any additional thoughts kind of after the event. I've written down the ideas that were raised so far. So we will look into those as well. Just kind of wanted to get a sense of interest in these areas. So water, how many other folks are interested in maybe having a speaker come and talk about water at the next event? You can put up your physical hand, you can put up your virtual hand. Okay, I'm seeing hands up, thumbs up. All right, that's definitely something that we can bring to our next event. Side note, just because the subject of water has come up, CSJs are hosting a talk with Maud Barlow on October 3rd. So we'll be connecting with her then. Maybe some ideas will come out of that conversation as well, because obviously she's got to focus on water. The Heirloom Seed Project. Who would like to hear about the Heirloom Seed Project? Anyone? Is that something? Okay. So some interest. And then the third idea that was raised was Indigenous management of lands. Who's interested in that?
Just to say that one might connect with the seed one, depending on who we have, but some of them, like,
yeah,
the person I suggested actually does both of those. So
yeah, absolutely.
Possibility.
Okay. Yes, and obviously, like, we know that this, like, the integral ecology approach and the interconnectedness of all of these issues. But this is helpful feedback for us as a coordinating committee to think about in terms of how we plan things moving forward and what our focus might be, and where people's interest is in terms of coordinated action. We brought up.
There was a fourth suggestion brought up by Sue, which was related to the question of advocacy going into COP15 and what we should do with that. She suggested one organization that has some advocacy going forward, but it would be important, I think, to know what we would like to advocate since that international conference is right here in Canada. So I wanted that that suggestion from Sue to be mentioned as well, or remembered.
Yeah, and that brings me to another question I had, which was how many folks are interested in or planning to attend, either you or somebody else from your congregation. Sabrina will be going from our ministry in our office, and it would be great to connect her with anyone else from other religious communities who might be attending. So is anyone else planning on going to Montreal? Yeah, Sue, Mark,
maybe.
Darlene, maybe. I'm seeing, yeah, some sort of like maybes. Okay, so I got Sue, Mark, Darlene, Agnes. Did I miss someone else? Richard. Great. Oh yeah, you were on my next page of faces. That's why I missed you. Thanks, Richard. Okay, so we can certainly get you like in touch with one another as well. And we could help facilitate conversation there about what we can go into COP15 with, and we can bring that again. We'll bring that to the next event in October. That can be one of our areas of sort of focus or interest of conversation, because although there might just be a small group of us who are attending, it will be important for all of the congregations to be on the same page and have a coordinated, concerted effort with that stuff.
I think there might be a time consideration there. I think there's something, maybe Sabrina, you know this better, like you have to signal that you want to participate by September 30th or something. Is that right?
If we want to have a side event, so if there's like a workshop or a side event, I believe that is the deadline that's quickly coming up. But to attend, I don't think that there's any firm deadline as of yet.
Okay.
All right, so Sabrina will get you to send a follow-up email to those who are going, and we'll have that conversation as well. I'm just trying to look at my many different pages of notes here and see, because I recognize that we're at 3:30 now. Well, we have, yes, Agnes.
Sorry, I won't take long. I'm part of a meeting tomorrow with the members of the Laudato Si Secretariat, members of the planning group for the COP meeting in Montreal, and people from the Archdiocese of Montreal. So there's about 10 of us now on that planning meeting that's happening tomorrow. I don't know if there's room for more people to join, but I can certainly send a follow-up to members of this group of what's discussed there, and maybe we can merge the efforts.
Excellent. So we'll have you and Sabrina do a follow-up there so that we can make sure that everyone's on the same page. Wonderful. In terms of action, Friday is the Global Climate Strike. I encourage everyone to see what's happening in your local community, what events you can join and participate in. I know here in Toronto, we're having a rally and a march here by Queen's Park. There will be an interfaith event, an interfaith rally before the main rally. That's happening at 12:30. So I'll put that that information in the chat. What am I forgetting, team? Is there anything else before we wrap up?
I don't think so, but at the same time, I could be wrong.
Just to say thanks to Mark for his work.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you to Mark for your insightful and thoughtful presentation. Thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your day to be here. We'll send the recording as a follow-up. And I know somewhere we gave the link for registering for the next event. So we'll also send you that sort of follow-up by email as well. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you all back here next month.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Be well.
Bye.